Hellman. I was in the history department, and I was one of the founding members of Jewish Studies. And I just, there was just a small group of us, and we were called a marching band, and that's what we were. And I have been so thrilled all these years in this lecture on my field. I'm in the Jews of the history of Spain. I don't deal with them after they leave and go to into the diaspora, into the Sephardic diaspora. We're more and more specializing, as I think you've gotten a sense of that by the first lecture. The island of Rhodes, there were many people before on the island of Rhodes and many people afterwards, but the Jewish community was there, and we are going to hear from Dr. Rodrigue about it.
I'd like to thank you again for coming, and I'd like also, of course, to thank once again both the generosity of the Stroms for enabling this series of lectures in its 30th anniversary, and of course to the Jewish Studies program for having invited me. It's a great privilege to be here. It's also a great privilege for me to be in this particular city with these particular Sephardic communities with their special links to the places that I'm talking about, which is quite rare in the United States, and so this has, of course, a special resonance for me as well, and I'm very much conscious of that, and I am very pleased and honored to be here. In September of 1943, the Nazis arrived in Rhodes and took the island from the Italians. There was actual fighting with the Italians. There were, in the Dodecanese Islands, that is to say the 12 islands that made up that part of the Aegean island chain, which had been under Italian control since 1912, or had been in fact conquered by the Italians. There were 47,000 Italian soldiers at that time, and 9,000 Wehrmacht, that's say German army soldiers that arrived, that overpowered and in fact killed many thousands of Italians in that process. After the asking by the Italians for an armistice, or that followed the fall of Mussolini. The armistice was in September 43, and in order to prevent this very strategic island in the Aegean from falling into the hands of the British, which were just outside and were in the process of trying to get control of it, the Germans invaded. Just as, by the way, they will invade Italy proper in that particular period. And as you may remember from my very first lecture, they will invade the Italian-controlled parts of southern Greece, including Athens, because they decided that they had to take over in order not to lose it to the Allies or to others. Now, nothing much will happen against the Jews, of about a population of 1,800 or so, until July the 12th of 1944. That is to say, between September 43 and July 12, 1944. On that day, rather abruptly, they limited the movement of Jews to the parts of the town of Rhodes itself. They also, in some outlying villages to which many had fled to escape Allied bombings, and in fact Jews had, like others, suffered and some had been killed from Allied bombings campaigns in Rhodes. They limited the freedom of movement of the Jews very abruptly. On 18th of July, and obviously the chain of destruction had already been decided, all male Jews above the age of 16 and above were asked to present themselves to the building of an old Italian Air Headquarters Aeronautics Ministry building, which up until then, and indeed for the whole period, was known by its old Turkish name of Çimenlik. The Jews, these male Jews, were asked to arrive with their ID cards and work permits. This was transmitted to the Jewish community via the president of the community, Jacob or Jacob Franco Shalem. And this was interpreted, since this usually was the custom of the Germans in this particular period, this was interpreted as basically by the Jews as part of a pattern of German policy where in areas where they arrived, they put male Jews to work in labor battalions. The documents were taken, and in a completely classic pattern, this we can find in all the small Greek towns, Balkan towns, the town of Demotika or Didymatikon that I mentioned in the first time. This is almost always the pattern. The male Jews come in, they're asked to register, they are trapped, and then their families are called in to join them with all their valuables, with all of their important possessions. That is precisely what happened. They are imprisoned. The president of the community was asked to tell the remaining family members to join them with valuables and with provisions. On the 20th of July, all of the Jews were in fact trapped. Their possessions are taken. On 23rd of July of 1944, they embark on 3 small ships, 1,769 total, according to the latest, most reliable research that has been done. And 51 from the island of Kos will join them in Leros here, as the ship leaves going to Leros. The 51 Jews from the island of Kos will join them with another ship, and 4 ships will take 8 days to cross into from Rhodes to Athens to Piraeus. These are very small, essentially glorified barges, to the Haidari camp, which was in fact a transit camp, and they will arrive there on the 31st of July of 1944. 5 Jews will die en route. More will die in Haidari, which is in horrible conditions, where there'll be all kinds of exactions on them and all kinds of mistreatment, further taking away of property. And by the way, one of the aspects that we are now particularly conscious of in terms of the Holocaust, which has really gained a lot of historical attention in the last years, and now that I've been doing research on these communities also, is the looting part of this whole phenomenon, this extraordinary economic banditry that took place of confiscation, but not necessarily even through formal means, but informal means, individual soldiers, SS officers, that is to say absolute looting of property, and all the accounts and all the records also demonstrate this was happening in Rhodes, this happened in Greece, this happened in all kinds of other places. And Haidari, as a transit camp in Athens, was precisely the locale where the last time before they were put on the cattle cars, this took place. On the 3rd of August, the train left, and 13 days on the way to Auschwitz-Birkenau till 16th of August of 1944 when they arrived. 22, according to latest research, died in that train with, of course, horrible sanitary conditions and cattle cars with very little food and water. 600 will be put to work, 600 men and women upon arrival. The rest will be gassed upon arrival. And of those 600, 437 will die. There were 42 Jews who were saved on the island of Rhodes. They were saved by the Turkish consul, Selahattin Ülkümen, who actually in 1900 will be the first Muslim and the first Turk and the only Turk to have received, of course, the name, the righteous Gentile in Yad Vashem. And the Turkish consul who was in this town, because in this city, in the island of Rhodes, which still had a substantial Turkish Muslim population, and had not, because it had been under Italian rule, subject to the Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1923. There was an interest by Turkey to maintain a consular representation. Selahattin Ülkümen could really only rely on 13 people who had real, regular Turkish passports, but he counted against the strict interpretation of the Turkish law the spouses as well as some relatives, and included that number to 42, went and systematically and stopped their deportations And those Jews, because Turkey had not entered the war and were considered part of a neutral country, were not deported. They were asked to report after all the Jews of Rhodes left. They were asked to report regularly to the Germans until January the 10th of 1945. They will be sent by boat, by literally sort of small barges to Turkey, to Marmaris, which is right here, which is in fact 20 miles away. And this, by the way, just as I'm talking about Demotica, or the Demotikon last time, which was a frontier town, for those of you who heard of the Greek-Turkish border, for the historian who is analyzing all of this, there is a special poignancy to all of this because it is so close to where they could all have been saved. It is so close, only a few miles, a boat ride away. In Demotica, we're talking about 2 to 5 miles on the Greek-Turkish border in Thrace. Here, all of these islands are sometimes, they are actually visible. The Turkish coasts are visible, and yet heavily militarized. People would not leave their families. Older people wouldn't embark upon perilous journeys. It just simply, people were not prepared to take that action. And of course, it was by no means guaranteed that it would all have been received by the country they may go to, because of course there were always problems with refugees. Very briefly, in rather cold description, this is what happened to the Rhodes community and its eradication of all but a handful through the Holocaust. As we look at the date and the timing here, the timing of this, the summer of 1944, is of course the height of the frenzied deportation of Hungarians, of Hungarian Jewry. You can do a timeline of what is actually happening. Also, it is an extremely late deportation. They are arriving, after all, on 16th of August on 1944 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. The last gassings in Birkenau are in November of 1944. So this is only a few months before. And it is 27th of January of 1945 when the Russians enter Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the deportations are really just before the end. And I think when we look at this, and this has certain kind of particularities. This is the deportation furthest away to Auschwitz in terms of place. There is no other place where a whole community is deported further. The longest trip, because there is a sea voyage, and then there is a transit camp in Haidari outside Athens. Then there is a train ride that is interminable. Already Athens is very far away by train from Auschwitz. It's a unique sea voyage. Why, a lot of historians have asked, if the Germans were intending to kill them, did they not kill them there? It would have been relatively easy. Certainly with the Einsatzgruppe in Eastern Europe, they killed tens of thousands of people over days. We're talking about a very small community, comparatively speaking. Why did they not kill them there? Also, there are other cases where these sea voyages ended very badly. For example, we don't know quite what happened, but there are about 300 Jews of Crete who are also put on boats, and the boats disappear. Some people believe that they were sunk, and some others believe that the British bombed them, thinking they were military boats. But obviously, it's relatively easy to sink boats in the middle of the Aegean. You don't need to take these people all the way to the machinery of destruction. And here, if I may only very briefly put myself in the perspective of what I called last time perpetrator history, the history of the perpetrators, of the planning and all of this, I think this deportation from Rhodes shows, in fact, the absolute rigid bureaucratic set of mechanisms by which the German process of destruction of the Jews, the final solution, had been set by this period. It was not left to chance. It was supposedly to be done in an orderly manner. That is, in fact, how the Holocaust evolved, from more random face-to-face killing to more mechanized killing, and then, of course, all at the same time, as we now know, continuing, of course, massacres that take place, but still the whole structure itself was very well established. So we have an almost lunatic trip, in some ways, that is taking place from one end, really from the borders of Europe, by now Asia, all across the seas, through the Balkans, through Central Europe, to a place where all those people are being brought over to be killed. So this is something to do with the inner logic of the perpetrators' mechanisms of the structure, and there's a certain bureaucracy of it that is built into this whole process. Now, I am a historian of the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. I knew full well that Rhodes had been conquered by Italy in 1912. I knew full well that Italians had been there for a long time. And yet, and here I return to my first theme of my very first lecture, there was a moment of shock, because we don't think of Rhodes as being Italy. We think of it almost naturally and symptomatically as Greece. That is the naturalized category of Greece, which shows, and to me, who has spent indeed this was a shock and surprise, even to me, who spent a lot of time interrogating what I called last time the tyranny of the nation-state model in terms of analyzing these kind of Jewish communities. This category of country of Italy, where these Jews are supposed to come from, appears so strange, and yet really in some ways illuminates the total artificiality of, as far as what I've called Jewish geographies are concerned, of this latest categories of Greek Jew, Turkish Jew, Yugoslav Jew, Serbian Jew, all of a sudden Jews of Rhodes who become Italian, and yet, of course, they're not Italian, and yet they are, of course, Italian citizens. So for that brief period of time. And I think it proved to me once again that when we look at these things from the optic of Jewish history, we have to ask somewhat different questions and be aware of different narratives. And it's only that way that we can get away from a teleological argument whereby somehow the history of this community ends up in the terminus point of what is today, what we call the place, what it is today, that it actually is a multiple history. And there can be no more, perhaps, multiple history than this particular island and this region. Let's take a look at this history in its multiplicity. First of all, Rhodes is at the core of the Levant, a word that got pejorative meanings for a while, but that perhaps represents more than any other word the mixed populations, religions, and cultures of this part of the world. It is at the crossroads of all of trade routes, from north through the Black Sea down to Egypt, from the east, the Western Mediterranean to the Eastern Mediterranean, a major port city, and also a very strategically important place, very close to the heart of Ottoman territories in the 5 centuries that preceded it. So Rhodes, in some ways, is almost a perfect case study to take a snapshot of what Levantine Jewry was about in the last 5 centuries. Rhodes had been first, if we go back, we don't want to go back all the way to antiquity, but go back really to the Middle Ages, had been Byzantine, Venetian, Genoese. In 1306, the Knights of St. John, coming back from the Crusades after the debacle of the Crusades, having moved to Cyprus, being kicked out of the Holy Land, moved to Cyprus and having to leave it, also bought it from the Genoese in 1306. They are themselves a multiple linguistic and group of knights and people from all different places in Europe who had arrived and were really engaged in what we would now call smuggling and contraband across the Mediterranean in terms of making a living, but also occupying a very important crossroads kind of area. And they remain there, challenged by several invasions, most importantly in 1480 by the great, of course, Mehmet the Conqueror, Mehmet II, who had conquered Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire, but he's repulsed and dies, in fact, very soon thereafter. His armies are repulsed until the island will become Ottoman in 1522. The Ottomans will arrive in 1522 and will remain there until 1912. Then the Italians will arrive because the Italians have conquered Libya from the Ottomans in 1911, and they, as an extension of this, make actually a trial run to attack the Ottomans. Actually, even in Dardanelles, they are repulsed. On their way to Turkey, they kind of decide they can go no further and just grab the Dodecanese Islands in the process. The future of the island isn't clear. They will remain there until 1923. They will remain in a kind of illegal or non-legalized way until 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne will give the islands definitively to the Italians. Will remain, therefore, under Italian rule until 1943. From 43 to 45, it is under Nazi German rule. From 1945 to 1947, it is under English rule. And 1947, it is given to Greece. And then, and only then, is this a Greek island, when, in fact, for centuries, of course, there is no such category that had actually existed. So this is a microcosm of all of these transformations and of multiple sediments and layers of things that are going on. And especially if we look at the population background, we see that it's mixed. There is demographically, it's a mixture of Muslim, Greek Orthodox, Jewish, and Catholic throughout these periods, with ebbs and flows. And the first Jews, of course, who lived there were Romaniot Jews, that is, say, Byzantine Jews, who spoke Greek of the Byzantine period. But already in the 13th century, when there is a brief period of Saracen rule by the Muslim Saracens, there are some Sephardi Jews from Tarragona who will move in from Spain already in the 13th century. And then when we have also Italian Jews. And in 1522, when the Ottomans come, they do something that they did in a lot of newly conquered territory. They did it first in Istanbul or Constantinople. They did it in a lot of other lands. They applied what was then known as the policy, to use the Turkish word, of sürgün. Not what this word now has come to mean, called exile, but an involuntary but strategically and economically important transfer of population. That is, say, they go and transfer both Muslim peasants from Anatolia to Rhodes, as they will do to Cyprus in 1571. But since the Jews are considered an economically useful population, they will also go to the major Jewish community of Salonika, and which by then has already the largest Jewish population in one city in the world, over 25,000. The newly arrived Jews from the Iberian Peninsula after 1492, and they will, quote unquote, exile some families or transfer some families to Rhodes. That is to say that almost all of Rhodes Jewry, even though there will be the core constituency of Rhodes Jewry, was originally from Salonika in 1522. And of course, periodically, they will be coming from Asia Minor and Izmir and other places over the centuries. But the core group of Rhodes Jewry was this transfer of 1522. Now, the Ottomans didn't do it for punishment. They gave them tax privileges. They gave them no taxation for a century. They gave them certain parts of the quarter of the city to live there, usually near the citadel, the core of Ottoman power. And it is here that then we have a small segment of what I call the transplanted Sepharad is reconstructed and reconstituted. What what, of course, the Rhodes will call the Chika Yerushalayim, the small Jerusalem, the little Jerusalem that I actually mentioned last time, and a lot of people, of course, whether it's Sarajevo or other places, also call their communities that. But really, we have in a microcosm in Rhodes, to call it by its name, that the Jews themselves called and the Ottoman rulers did. The same way, we have a microcosm of a community that is classical in almost all of the Ottoman Levantine lands, with its rabbinical leaderships, its Beth Din, the religious core system, its philanthropic institutions, its rabbinical families from Imberga to Busal to Basan to Frankfurt, and most importantly, towards the end, the famous Israel family of rabbis, eventually from one major synagogue to four synagogues, a Juderia, that is a Jewish quarter, really very close in Rhodes town, in the Muslim quarter. Actually, it's interesting that the Muslims and the Jews are the majority of the town of Rhodes, and the other groups, mostly the Greek groups, are really in the other towns, as villages, and in the countryside. We have, therefore, a community that is astride at the crossroads of this Ottoman Levantine world. Rhodes, however, will very, as in the course of the 17th century, we have the rise of a major new Ottoman port city. Until the 19th century, much more important than Salonika. Salonika declines in the middle of the 17th century, and we have the rise of Izmir as the most important port community. That is going to be across the Aegean. Further north here, the Izmir right here, as you can see, Rhodes is going to be for a very long time in the orbit of Western Asia Minor, right across from the Straits, and very much an outpost of Izmir in terms of circulation of families, of networks, of all kinds of things, until in the 19th century, when Salonika rises again as a very major and much more important port than Izmir, and then they, of course, get realigned towards there. We have a couple of other events that are very important. First of all, there is, especially in Jewish history, 1840 is a very important date. 1840 is a very important date because it is the date of the famous Damascus affair, where there's a blood libel accusation against the Jews in Damascus for having killed a Christian, for using the blood for the purposes of matzah making during Passover, and the Christian populations get usually periodically around that time extremely upset about these kind of things, and there are usually riots. And exactly the same time, there is going to be a blood libel accusation against the Jews by the Christian population of Rhodes, and European Jewry. And this is very important also from the perspective of what's going to happen as far as the Levantine world is concerned. The European Jewry itself, from Sir Moses Montefiore of London to Adolphe Crémieux in Paris, will mobilize and will arrive and go to the Sultan and obtain a ferman, or a decree stating that there is no truth to a blood accusation, and releasing the Jews. There is, in fact, systematically through these centuries, a direct alliance, vertical alliance between the Jews and the Ottoman sultans and the Central Powers, as opposed to horizontal alliances of other groups who are their competitors and who have other kind of claims to the economy and political power and influence. And therefore, the linkage with the protector, who are the Ottomans, is very strong, and in 1840, that still begins to take place. But paradoxically, that still takes place. But paradoxically, 1840 also inaugurates the end or the beginning of the process of a slow-moving, a long-term process of Levantine Jewry slowly reorienting itself away from the Ottoman world towards Europe, because as these Europeans arrive, eventually will come other European influences, European economic influences, European political domination, and indeed European schools and European culture and French. And the schooling system of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the French Jewish school system, which was spread throughout the Jews of the Mediterranean basin. And the Jews will begin to reorient themselves towards another pole of attraction away from now weakening Ottoman state, even though they will remain patriotic towards the end, but yet they are beginning to look at this new force, this new pole of attraction, which is emanating from Paris in terms of culture, but also very generally speaking towards what we have now in a code word called modernity. That is to say, a kind of expectation of progress to come from the West. So we have indeed in Rhodes itself this very process epitomized by 1899, the creation of the Alliance School. By the way, the leading historian of Ottoman Jewry, Avram Galante, the first historian, had family links in Rhodes. His sister was there and perished during the Holocaust, but he himself was instrumental in creating this particular school. 1910, therefore, if we freeze the frame in 1910, we have in this whole Dodecanese region 147,000 people. Rhodes and Kos are the main islands. The island of Rhodes itself has a population of 45,000. I'm just giving you the numbers. The Rhodes town, that is to say, the major place of population in here, has a total population of 16,150. Muslims form 40% of the town. Greeks form 33% of the town. The Jews form, with around 3,000, 25% of the town. And there are other groups, smaller groups there, in 1912. The Jews, in the course of the 19th century, had been involved in all kinds of trade, but eventually had become an impoverished community. This island lived for a long period of time off the sponge trade, with divers, Greek divers usually, diving deep, getting the sponge, and the Jews were the middlemen, selling it to world markets in sponges. And there are other sources that begin to emerge in the course of the 19th century, and there is really, it's an arid landscape. There is not much in the course of decline of a lot of ships going by it and all of that in the course of the 19th century. There's not much of economic development, and therefore in this particular period, this is largely an impoverished community. A very impoverished community at the very end of Ottoman rule. And it is here that, of course, and this, I think, a large part of the audience here will know what follows from this. It is here that we have the story of the Rhodos diaspora, or emigration, that begins to take place. That is to say, and it's interesting, I think, that this is not, in fact, a Jewish phenomenon. It's a Greek phenomenon initially. It's the Greeks of Rhodes who don't have an economic livelihood and who begin to emigrate to the New World and to a lot of other places, and soon word gets out and the Jews themselves will follow the Greeks in emigration from the Dodecanese, but especially from Rhodes. And so at this particular period, already by 1895, we have the first Rhodeslis in Africa. In 1905, I've always wondered at the extraordinary coincidence of the name Rhodesia and the Jews of Rhodes ending in Rhodesia, but in 1905 they are there. In 1910, 6 of the 10 financiers in a boom area then, Katanga of Belgian Congo in Elisabethville, are already Jews from Rhodes. And of course in 1900, the first Jews from Rhodes begin to arrive in Seattle with 40 families in 1910. So we have a subcategory of the Sephardi diaspora. The core heartland is intact more or less in 1910, and yet there are beginnings of migrations, very small migrations, really very few real migrations until the 1890s, and really most of them will be post-1908, when, of course, there is going to be conscription in the Ottoman Empire, and many people did not particularly relish the idea of going into the army, but also poverty, and also, by the way, the pole of attraction of this new force in the world, that is to say the West, and the possibility of improving one's lot by emigrating. So we have a veritable, and this is very unique, that really requires sociological analysis, I think, much more than it has been studied, a real sub-diaspora of the Rhodes in the US, in New York, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, in Africa, and which continues, of course, to this day, including Brussels and Cape Town and all of these places that have created a subcategory, so that, in fact, Jews of Rhodes origin outnumbered those who had stayed behind in that period. Now, to come to the period of the Italians, and you will see how this will intersect with this let's say, dislocation, but to some extent reorientation, of which the diaspora is one phenomenon. That is, a reorientation towards the West as a new power as a new pole of attraction, but also benefiting economically in other ways from there. And we have a unique situation in the Judeo-Spanish world with Rhodes. And this makes it absolutely unique, because it is not just that Italians conquer Rhodes. It doesn't even begin to summarize what symbolically and in other ways that means. Rhodes is the only Judeo-Spanish community that is part of the colonization project. That is to say, it is the only community in the, this will happen, of course, in all kinds of other Sephardi and Mizrahi or Eastern Jewish communities in North Africa and elsewhere, but the Judeo-Spanish world will, on the whole, move, as I talked about it last time, will move from empire, the disintegration and fragmentation of the heartland of the empire, the weakening, and its replacement by the nation state. Rhodes is a little sliver of a place, comparatively speaking, where there is a detour until 1947, where the nation-state arrives, which is Greece. There is a detour which is via colonialism. Now, that story is going to affect a lot of non-European Jewry, but it does not really, it's not part of the narrative of, in fact, the Judeo-Spanish community. So it's doubly interesting to observe, as it were, in situ, in Rhodes, how this process of colonialism takes place. What does it mean here with the arrival of the Italians? The arriving of the Italians means, in fact, the arrival, and this is the way it was interpreted, the arrival of modernity. The Italians, who were part of engaging in building an empire, wanting their place in the sun, as it were, being latecomers, who went to Libya, then Ethiopia, Somalia, engaged in a lot of futile wars and a lot of other kind of activities to create their own empire, were very self-conscious of having been behind in what was considered the European project of colonization, so which made countries great. So when they arrived in Rhodes, this being part of Europe, as it were, so close, considered in Europe, they decided to make Rhodes the showcase of Italian colonialism. So we have frenzied activity that begins to take place with the building of roads, of harbor, of grandiose new buildings, of what the Italians thought the medieval hospitallers or the knights would have looked like, a kind of a fake medievalism of grandiose fascist architecture. And there is also, I was actually quite stunned to find out, this becomes already a tourist destination with facilities built for tourists, with aircraft, with basically regular aircraft service. There is also a lot of activity now in terms of linkage with another big boom colonized or colonialized, semi-colonialized area that is Egypt, which is itself a boom economy, and there is in fact a lot of coming, going and coming that is going to take place. So the island, especially under the Governor General Mario Lago between 1924 and 1936, goes through a boom period where the Italians are pouring a lot of money and are embarking upon a project of Italianization. So, one of the very first acts, of course, of Italianization is the school system, which usually goes to the heart of this, so that the Alliance school is closed or replaced by the Italian school in 1925. That is, where the curriculum is Italian. There is rapid Italianization of the Jews of Rhodes, who, of course, switch now to the new ruler, and the new ruler that is Europe. It's Europe that has come to Rhodes, and the project of Europeanization and modernization was already a project that had been embarked upon 50 years prior to the Italians of Rhodes. Now, the Jews of Rhodes, they had no wish for the Italians to arrive. But once they came, it actually, at that time, completely tallied with their own set of expectations of what modernity was going to be around. Of course, there's a little bracket here I have to open. These Italians, by 1924, are fascist Italians. They are not just any regime. This is the Mussolini regime that is arriving. But nevertheless, even though under that kind of authoritarian regime, it would be fair to say that from 24 to 36, under Mario Lago, with an Italian press, Italian schooling, and Italian language-based rabbinical seminary, the Collegio Rabbinico, created in 1927, by the way, decided very much by the Italian government as a source of influence of Sephardi rabbinate, if they could somehow influence the making of rabbis, so that this actually is a very late, it's in fact, in some ways, well, it's not in some ways, it is the last major rabbinical seminary in the old Sephardi world that is created in 1927, which won't train a lot of people, about 15 students all in all, but who will have, after graduation, a major role to play. But so to kind of re-emphasize this particular point, and that's why I actually went earlier, and you will see how the story actually merges. That is to say, merges with, in fact, what will happen later on, which is that from their Ottoman moorings, through the incursion of Europe and colonialism, which is its last installment, as it were, this community takes perhaps to the nth degree what other Judeo-Spanish communities of where they were could not. Because in a lot of other places, in Salonika, or in Istanbul for that matter, or in Belgrade, all of these communities did meet modernity, but they made it through the local nation state in its politicized form. In Rhodes, that is, say, what they used to think of modernity comes as this external Italian colonialist project. And the Jews reorient themselves and find themselves a place within that project, are very pro-Italian, and will in fact identify with the larger Italian project. Until, of course, the tide turns. It already begins to turn when a very hardcore fascist, Mario De Vecchi, one of the quadrumvirate, that's the four who had been in the march to Rome in the beginning of the Mussolini regime, one of the founders of fascism, who had fallen sort of out, because after all, this is not a plum job necessarily, had been the governor of Somalia from another place, 1923 to 1929, another Italian colony, becomes the governor general. And he is much more authoritarian, and he is a much more radical Italianizer. And it is under him that, of course, Mussolini's anti-Semitic legislation of 1938 will come into play and be implemented to its full extent in Rhodes. In 1938, to the great surprise and consternation of the Italian Jewish community that up until then, throughout Italy, had been very pro, or at least had been ultra patriotic and had been involved with the regime, Mussolini decides, in order to curry favor with Hitler, as part of the strategic kind of policies that he was pursuing, that he had to instill anti-Semitic legislation, which meant, of course, quotas, the Jews being thrown out of public service, all kinds of petty restrictions in the economy, and a kind of a closing of the horizons in general. And De Vecchi, the new governor general, will implement them to the full and to even further. He will close the rabbinical college. He will ban ritual slaughter for meat. He will not accept the closing of shops on Saturday. Will make Saturday opening compulsory. Will close the separate Jewish school and will enforce the going of Jews to the regular schools with the radical Italianization. Although that's kind of a paradox, because in a lot of other places the Jews are thrown out, or in anti-Semitic Nazi Germany, the Jews are thrown from German schools and have to go to Jewish schools. But here the push is to do away with communal autonomy and will ban the Greek and Turkish and Jewish communal autonomous institutions and tribunals. And in a foreshadowing of what I talked to you about Salonika and the cemetery being confiscated by the municipality, will confiscate the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, and take it over for new buildings, and the Jews will be obliged to reinter those who were buried there elsewhere. He will also expel, and this is part of 1938 legislation under Italy, he will expel Jews who were not Italian citizens, who had arrived from Turkey or other places, about 103 families, according to the latest statistics, all in all about 480 Jews. They will be given until 1939 to leave. There will be a great deal of appeals for those Jews to stay. Luckily for them, with the benefit of hindsight now, his mind could not be changed, and they were expelled. Most of them end up in Tangier, of all places, in North Africa, which actually did not require visas at the time, which was an international city, and that had a local Jewish community that was receiving refugees. So they, of course, will save themselves by having to leave. And the situation of the Jews is, therefore, one very similar to that obtained under Italian control in other lands, in other places. But what we see in here is the flip side of colonialism. That is to say, it's not that Italy just arrived and transforms the Jews or yanks them away from their old moorings. It does bring in the modern project. It does bring in grandiose new buildings and new roads and new airplanes and airports and a modern bureaucratic administration. But it also brings in a type of anti-Semitism unknown in these parts before. There'd always been ethnic conflict. Greeks, Jews, Armenians, Turks, any group you could name, like in other parts of the world, had always engaged in a coexistence that was occasionally interrupted by violence, and that then was restabilized over a kind of a cycle over time with, of course, great variations. But it's not that conflict wasn't there, but bureaucratized, systematized, modernized anti-Semitism in a way that was rationalized arrives for the very first time in these parts with this full brunt of the colonial rule that begins to show, of course, its true face that accompanies so-called progress. That say, both are in fact its true faces, both progress and brutality. The two are inextricable in many ways, and from here we begin to see, in fact, this outside force that now really has arrived in to the full extent into this island itself. So we come back to the beginning of where I started. The Italian 1938 legislation could have stopped where it did, before if the Germans had not arrived. So the 1938 legislation, even though it was harsh, restrictive, and anti-Semitic, had, of course, its own logic. And the Italians were not known for pushing these, certainly in Italy and elsewhere, towards the very harsh, ideologized, racialized Nazi direction. This was a bureaucratic anti-Semitism that was in place, but that was broken in practice in many, many cases. And after De Vecchi leaves and is replaced by Campione, a lot of these laws are relaxed. It could have stopped there, except for the last installment of this outside force, that is, say, the arrival of the Nazis. And that had to do with strategy, with where the island was, the timing, all kinds of variables that are actually impossible to have predicted ahead of time, like in a lot of other places. And there we have one step further than the bureaucratic anti-Semitism of petty anti-Semitism, which has, of course, very real consequences and hardship, but did not include murder. There we have another more eschatological, different kind of racialized, eugenics-type anti-Semitism that comes in, that has to, in fact, ship the Jews all the way from one end of the Mediterranean to Central Europe in order to facilitate their extermination, because, of course, the World War II was not just a war for Nazi supremacy, it was also a war against the Jews. It was the two sides of the same medallion. So, on the one hand, we saw that, in fact, from the Jewish story, the Holocaust story, the perpetrator story, these different narratives, what happens in Rhodes situates itself or is embedded in all of those narratives. That is, say, the Holocaust, the Nazis, and the larger story. In some ways, it is yet one other example of what happened in thousands of other communities of that kind. But here there is something else also. The Holocaust, that really played such a central role in the destruction of the Sephardi Levant, comes at the tail end, to some extent, of another process, even though it's an external process. But I need to talk about this other process that had been going on for at least another century. And that is what we can call the great unmixing of the populations that came in the last century of the Ottoman Empire and during its fall. The end of the Ottoman Empire, basically, brought in the kind of the century of decline and rising of the new nation states, created new shattered zones of borderlands, zones of borders that shift, that brought and crystallized ethnic conflicts, that in fact created them, and in fact brought around a general process of ethnic cleansing, in many cases murderous ethnic cleansing. As the Ottoman Empire retreated, the Muslims that were left behind were systematically expelled from the Balkans, with the shifting of the borders from Russia, first with Crimea and then in the Caucasus. Hundreds of thousands of other Muslims were expelled and died en route as refugees. Then we had the deportation and mass destruction of the Armenians during World War I. Then we have the massive Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1923. We have a complete disintegration of the Ottoman-Levantine mosaic with new exclusionary states and new, frequently murderous policies. These policies of unmixing, are policies of transfers and exchanges, words that become and enter political vocabulary for the very first time and are theorized around that particular period, are discussed by diplomats, are discussed and implemented. And we have, therefore, a complete dislocation of multiple populations, where if you look at Greece today, or Turkey today, or Serbia, or a lot of these places, a quarter, sometimes half of populations of certain areas were not there 2 generations, 3 generations ago. Everybody was from somewhere else, and they did not emigrate willingly. They had to leave if they did not die en route or were not murdered. Now, the Jews were one of the last of these Ottoman Levantine remnants. And they were not the prime objects of this process of unmixing because, in fact, they posed no real strategic or real political threat. Nevertheless, they got mixed up with all of this because once you have new kind of nationalism and new kind of exclusive nation states came into being, the Jew as the other almost always got to be part of this process. But in the end, it took this completely outside murderous force, and this is the part of the process that really is something that is external, that accelerates what happens to the Jews and in fact takes it to the very end of a spectrum of ethnic cleansing, which is in fact of total mass murder. It took that from the Nazis to take the Jews out of the Levantine mosaic. And with it, with the Jews out also, with all of these other groups that also disappeared and dislocated, this kind of world of a mixed tapestry comes to an end with a whole new other and much darker world. Not that this world itself was not conflict-ridden, but a much harsher type of new political realities that begin to arrive in full force. In the island of Rhodes, as in much of the old Sephardi heartland of the Levant, no community could be rebuilt. Imagined by a specific diaspora, the Rhodeslis of the world. In fact, one is struck as a historian of, and I'm struck as a historian of Sephardi Jewry by this unique phenomenon of the Rhodos memory, which is unparalleled. There is a myth of Salonika, but it's not necessarily only of the Salonicans. It sort of has become a trope in a kind of an iconic place. But the memory of Rhodes is a result, in fact, sociologically of a compact community related with communal networks spreading around the world, but remaining in touch through family and other kind of networks. And all of a sudden, the originating mother community disappearing. The island of Rhodes, therefore, with the mother community gone, now almost mythic, remains alive in this imagination as the mother community. It also acts as a source of identity and as a source of collective reimaginings and identity building. It also, from the perspective that I have outlined, at least from my point of view, it also epitomizes the old Levantine matrix that exists no more, that was in fact essential to the making of the Judeo-Spanish world. Thank you.